The morning Jonah Rusk opened the first crate, 21 farmers came to watch him ruin himself. They lined the irrigation road beside his north paddy with coffee cups in their hands and mud on their boots. The way men gather when they think work is about to become entertainment. Inside the crate were freshwater crabs, 240 of them, small, brown, green. Hard-shelled things with raised claws and pinhead eyes, clicking against the plastic like they had been insulted by the ride. Jonah stepped into the shallow water, tipped the crate forward, and let the first wave of crabs spill into the rice. For 3 seconds, nobody said anything. Then, Amos Wren laughed so loudly, a red-winged blackbird lifted off the fence post. "Jonah," he called, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You growing rice or soup?" The others broke after that. Not cruelly, not at first. They had known Jonah since he was a boy. They knew his father. They knew his fields. But the laughter had a verdict inside it. A farmer who puts crabs in his rice has stopped farming and started guessing. Jonah heard all of it. He heard the jokes about bait buckets. He heard someone say he had finally read one pamphlet too many. He heard the youngest man there bet a diesel filter that the crabs would be dead by June. Jonah said nothing. He only stood in the brown water while the crabs vanished between the young stalks. And he wondered how foolish a man had to look before the land was allowed to prove him right. By harvest, those same farmers would come back to that paddy with notebooks. Lowbrook Delta was not a place that trusted new ideas quickly. The river split there into slow channels, and the fields lay flat and wet beneath a wide sky. In April, the paddies mirrored the clouds. In September, the rice bent gold under its own weight. Families had worked that land for 4 generations. Sometimes 5, and the older farmers carried that fact, like a title. Jonah Rusk was 42. He owned the same acres his father had once worked, and his grandfather before him. He had learned rice farming, the old modern way. Flood the field, plant the seed, spray the weeds, kill the insects, push the crop hard, then do it all again next year with a larger bill. For a while, that system made sense. The yields were good. The elevators were full. The chemical salesman knew every kitchen table in the Delta. But the numbers in Jonah's farm ledger had started telling a different story. Each season, he bought more herbicide to hold back the same weeds. Each season, he needed another pesticide pass when the leaf folders and stem borers came thick in the humid weeks. Fertilizer had gone from a tool to a debt. The fields still produced, but they felt like a tired animal pulling a wagon 1 mile farther than it wanted to go. Jonah noticed small things before he admitted the big thing. Fewer frogs in the drainage ditches, fewer dragonflies over the water. Mud that used to smell rich now smelled flat and sour when he lifted it in his hands. At the winter co-op meeting, he mentioned it once. Amos Wren looked over his glasses and said, "The rice still weighs, doesn't it?" "It weighs," Jonah said. Then quit listening to Mud. The room moved on, but Jonah could not. 3 weeks later, a pump belt snapped in his equipment shed during a rainstorm. While searching for the spare, Jonah pulled down an old metal box from a shelf above his father's workbench. Inside were invoices, pencil maps, seed tags, and a green notebook with his father's name on the front. Most of it was ordinary farm history. Then Jonah found a clipping folded into the back cover. It was an old agricultural bulletin about integrated rice systems. Rice with fish, rice with ducks, Rice with crabs. Not in a pond beside the crop. In the flooded crop itself. The article described a different kind of paddy. One that did not treat every living thing as an enemy. Aquatic animals ate insect larvae before they could chew the rice. They grazed tiny weed seedlings before the weeds could root. Their movement stirred oxygen into the water and sediment. Their waste fed microbial life in a slow, constant trickle, instead of the shock of a chemical dose. What stopped Jonah was not that the practice sounded new. It sounded old, older than his father, older than the co-op, older than the spray rigs parked outside every barn in Lowbrook Delta. That night, Jonah read until the house went quiet. By midnight, he had found university papers on rice, crab co-culture in Asia, and pilot trials in other wetland rice regions. The language was dry, but the pattern was not. Lower herbicide pressure, lower pesticide pressure, comparable or better yields, improved soil biology. A paddy, Jonah realized, did not have to be a factory floor. It could be a small city, if you were willing to let the right workers back in. He chose the North Paddy because it had embarrassed him for 3 straight seasons. 7/10 of a hectare, heavy weed pressure, weak tillering. A corner that always looked pale by midsummer, no matter how carefully he fertilized it. He ordered 240 juvenile freshwater crabs from a hatchery 2 counties over. He cut his planned chemical program on that section. He set up measuring stakes, photo points, and sampling rows. Every 9 days, he would count weed coverage. Every 2 weeks, he would inspect 60 rice stems for pest damage. He took baseline soil samples and sent them to the county lab. His wife, Elise, watched him spread the paperwork across the kitchen table. "You're really going to do this," she said. "I'm really going to test it." There's a difference between testing something and announcing it. Jonah looked up. Elise smiled gently. "Let the field talk first." He meant to follow that advice. He did not. At the March growers' meeting, someone asked why he was buying less herbicide than usual, and Jonah answered, honestly. He explained the North Paddy, the crabs, the records, the old research. He spoke carefully, not as a prophet, not as a salesman, only as a farmer with 1 bad field, and 1 idea worth testing. The room stayed quiet long enough for Jonah to hope he had been understood. Then, Amos Wren leaned back in his chair. "So the plan," Amos said, "is to let crabs do your spraying." The room cracked open. A man named Clay Hobb laughed into his coffee. The 2 Mercer brothers grinned at each other. Ray Dutton, who had farmed only 6 years, but mocked like he had earned 50, asked whether Jonah would be registering the field as seafood or grain. Jonah drove home with his ears hot. By the time the hatchery truck arrived 3 weeks later, the whole Delta knew. That was why 21 farmers were waiting by the irrigation road when he opened the crate. For the first 2 weeks, the joke seemed safe. The crabs moved through the shallow water, but the field did not transform. Weed seedlings still appeared. Insects still landed on the rice. 1 crab crawled up the levee and got carried away by a heron while Ray Dutton happened to be driving past, which meant the story improved by lunch. Jonah recorded everything anyway. North Paddy, day 9. Weed coverage slightly lower than control. Not enough to matter. Day 18. Crab activity strongest at dawn and dusk. Day 27. Barnyard grass thinner along the sampling transect. Day 36. Visible difference from the conventional paddies were beginning their familiar summer fight. Barnyard grass came on thick. Broadleaf weeds pushed through open water. Pest scars appeared on the rice leaves in little pale windows. But the crab paddy looked uneven in a different way. Not perfect. Not clean. Like a sprayed field. Looks clean for a week before the next problem rises. It looked occupied. The crabs worked the edges. They nosed under the waterline. They clipped at weed seedlings, while the weeds were still soft enough to disappear. They chased larvae in the warm shallows. They churned the mud into a faint cloudy ribbon wherever they passed. By week 6, Jonah's counts showed what his eyes had started to believe. In the conventional section, 16% of sampled stems carried meaningful insect damage. In the crab section, the number was just under 5. Weed density in the crab paddy was down by more than half, compared with the adjacent control. Jonah skipped one herbicide pass completely, and cut the second to a narrow border treatment. His pesticide use on that plot dropped by nearly 40% before August. The first man to stop laughing was not Amos. It was Ray Dutton. Ray parked by the road one evening and pretended to check a tire. After 5 minutes, he walked to the fence. "Still got crabs in there?" he asked. Jonah pointed to a ripple moving between 2 rows. Ray squinted. "They eating the weeds? Some of them? And bugs? Enough to annoy the bugs?" Ray nodded, as if he had not mocked the idea in front of half the county. "Could still hurt your yield," he said. "That's what we're waiting to find out." That became the new argument. The field looked healthier. Yes, the input bill was lower. Yes, but rice farming is not won in July. It is won when the grain comes across the scale. A pretty field can still disappoint you. In August, the delta turned hot and close. The kind of heat that sits under your hat and makes every pump engine sound tired. Insect pressure rose across the valley. Several farms sprayed twice in 10 days. Jonah sprayed his conventional fields on schedule. He did not spray the crab paddy. He walked it every morning, expecting the mistake to reveal itself. Instead, he found tillers thickening, panicles setting, water clearing faster. After disturbance, the soil test he ran with a field kit did not prove everything, but it pointed in the right direction. Higher biological activity, steadier available nitrogen, less of the sharp boom and drop pattern he saw after synthetic fertilizer applications. One evening, Jonah's mother came to see the field. She had not walked the paddies much since his father died. She stood on the levee in rubber boots, too clean for the place, and watched the water move. "Your father kept that clipping," Jonah said. "I know. You knew about it. He talked about trying something like this once." Jonah turned to her. She kept her eyes on the rice. "Your grandfather told him not to make the farm look ridiculous." A small crab surfaced beside a stalk, lifted one claw, then sank again. Jonah laughed once. Not because it was funny, because sometimes a family can inherit fear and call it tradition. September came in low and gold. The water receded. The rice heads bent heavy. Combines moved from field to field, like slow animals. Jonah harvested the conventional sections first, just as he had planned, so there would be no confusion in the records. Then he cut the north paddy. He watched the numbers come in from the weigh ticket, wrote them down, checked the moisture adjustment, and did the math twice. The crab paddy had yielded 9% higher per hectare than his best conventional section that year. Not 9% higher than the worst field, not 9% higher than a neglected corner, 9% higher than the best field he had farmed the usual way, and the input cost on that plot was dramatically lower. Herbicide down 65%, pesticide down nearly 40%. Fertilizer trimmed without a yield penalty. Jonah stood in the machine shed with the ledger open in both hands. For months, everyone had asked what the crabs would cost him. No one had asked what the old system was already costing the land. Elise found him there after dark. "Well?" she asked. Jonah turned the ledger toward her. She read the totals. Then she looked through the open shed door toward the north paddy, now stubbled and quiet under the first stars. "Tomorrow," she said, "you should let the field talk." By noon the next day, 3 farmers had called. By the end of the week, 6 had walked the plot. Ray Dutton came with a pocket notebook and asked careful questions. Clay Hobb wanted to see the soil report. The Mercer brothers stood at the edge of the paddy without joking, which was the closest they came to an apology. Amos Wren arrived last. He brought no notebook. He asked to see the yield ticket, the spray log, the weed counts, and the lab results. Jonah laid them out on the kitchen table. Amos read slowly. For 52 years, he had farmed in Lowbrook Delta. His hands were bent from work. His opinions were older than half the barns in the county. He had earned the right to be stubborn, but the field had earned the right to be believed. At last, Amos removed his glasses. "Your father would have hated being laughed at," he said. Jonah nodded. Then Amos looked toward the window, where the north paddy lay beyond the yard. But he would have liked the numbers. That winter, Jonah was invited to speak at a county soil health field day. He stood in a fluorescent lit hall beside a projector screen, wearing the same jacket he wore to funerals, and told the story plainly. He did not say crabs were magic. He did not say every farm should do exactly what he had done. He showed the records, the photos, the pest counts, the input costs, the yield ticket. He explained the mistakes too. A low levee that let several crabs escape, a timing issue with water depth, a border strip that still needed targeted weed control. The room listened hardest when he said the crabs were not the point. "The point," Jonah said, "is that the paddy was never empty. We made it empty. Then we spent money trying to replace all the jobs we removed." The following spring, 5 farms in Lowbrook Delta started small rice crab trials. Ray Dutton began with a 1/4 hectare and recorded everything like a man, afraid of being fooled. Clay Hobb tried a heavier stocking rate and learned quickly that more animals did not mean better balance. The Mercer brothers argued over whose plot looked cleaner. Even Amos Wren cut one narrow test strip behind his oldest barn, though he called it checking Jonah's arithmetic, and refused to call it an experiment. By the second harvest, the pattern was no longer a rumor. The trial plots were not identical. Some performed better than others. One failed because the water management was wrong. But across the successful paddies, chemical costs fell hard. Pest pressure stayed manageable, and yields held steady or rose. The fields sounded different too. That was the part Jonah could not put neatly on a slide. Frogs returned to the ditch by the north road. Dragonflies stitched the air above the flooded rows. The water did not carry the same harsh smell after rain. When Jonah pushed his hand into the mud, it held together with a living weight he remembered from childhood. The old system had taught the valley to see a farm as a machine inputs in, output out. Anything else was waste, threat, or sentiment. But a paddy is not a machine. It is a small city underwater. The rice is one citizen. The insects are another, the microbes, the weeds, the birds, the mud, the rain, the farmer. Even the crab with its ridiculous sideways walk. All of them are part of the argument the land is having with itself. For decades, Lowbrook Delta had tried to win that argument by silencing every voice except the crop. Jonah's crabs did not solve every problem. They simply let a few useful voices back in. Years later, people would tell the story as if Jonah had been brave from the beginning. He always corrected them. Bravery was too clean a word for what it felt like. It felt like standing ankle deep in muddy water while your neighbors laughed from the road. It felt like checking a field every morning for proof that you had not embarrassed your family name. It felt like trusting a thing you did not fully understand, because the thing you did understand was slowly failing. That was the real lesson the crabs carried through the rice. Old wisdom does not always arrive wearing dignity. Sometimes it arrives in a plastic crate, clicking and clawing and smelling faintly of river mud. Sometimes the future looks, at first glance, like a joke. The laughter was loud that spring. The crabs were quiet, but the quiet things stayed until harvest.